from stirring his expensive Colombian blend, acting as if he'd just commented on the weather forecast, rather than publicly humiliating me on my last day. 5 years. 5 years I'd given to the Immigrant Assistance Center. Late nights, weekends, holidays, clients who became like family, and this was my send-off. Is there something funny about my suggestion, Mira? Darren asked, finally looking up, his pale blue eyes narrowing at the small, involuntary sound that had escaped my throat. I placed my mug down carefully, feeling every pair of eyes in the room. Parvati from accounting, Tomas from legal aid, even the new intern, whose name I hadn't learned yet, all witnessing my public execution. No, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. Nothing funny at all. I walked to my desk, collected my few personal items, and placed my access badge on the reception counter. The security guard, Everett, who'd greeted me every morning for 5 years, couldn't meet my eyes as I walked past. Outside, the September sun felt too bright, too ordinary for a day that had just shattered my professional life. I crossed the street to the small park and sat, staring back at the gleaming glass building where Darren would continue destroying lives while building his empire. My phone buzzed with a message. All set for 2 p.m., Agent Kishi. 2 hours. In 2 hours, everything would change. If you're enjoying this story of workplace betrayal and justice, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, what happens next is something you won't want to miss. Drop a comment if you've ever experienced workplace injustice. Your story matters too. My name is Mira Acharya, 32 years old, first-generation American with Indian parents who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. Growing up, I watched my father work 3 jobs while my mother sewed late into the night, taking in alterations from neighbors. They pushed me to excel, to get the education they couldn't. When I graduated with my social work degree, the pride in their eyes meant everything. I wasn't supposed to end up unemployed and sitting on a park bench, watching federal agents prepare to raid my workplace. But then again, Darren Blackwood wasn't supposed to be exploiting desperate immigrants for personal gain. Let me rewind to the beginning. I was ecstatic when I landed the job at the Immigrant Assistance Center. The organization had a sterling reputation for helping newcomers navigate the labyrinthine immigration system, offering legal aid, language classes, job placement services, and community support, all funded by government grants and private donations. My parents had relied on a similar center when they arrived in America. This was my chance to pay it forward. Darren had been charming during my interview, passionate about the center's mission. We're not just helping individuals, he'd said, leaning forward, eyes intense. We're building the next generation of American success stories. I believed him completely. My first month was everything I'd hoped for. I connected clients with resources, helped families fill out complicated paperwork, translated when needed, and saw immediate positive impact. My supervisor, Leela, was supportive and kind, showing me the ropes with patience. The work was demanding but fulfilling. Then Leela was gone. Family emergency. Darren explained vaguely during a staff meeting. Indefinite leave of absence. I'll be directly overseeing Mira and the intake team until further notice. Something felt off about Leela's sudden departure. She hadn't mentioned any family issues during our lunch together the day before. But I pushed the concern aside, focusing instead on the opportunity to work directly with the center's director. The first red flag appeared 3 weeks after Leela left. A young mother named Adira came to the center with her 4-year-old son. Their appointment was with me, but Darren intercepted them in the lobby. "I'll handle this one, Mira," he said smoothly. "Mrs. Nasser's case requires executive attention." I watched through the glass wall of his office as he spoke to her, his expression grave. 20 minutes later, Adira emerged, clutching her son's hand, eyes downcast and red-rimmed. When I approached her, offering a tissue, she flinched away and hurried out. "Is everything okay with Mrs. Nasser?" I asked Darren later. "Some cases are more complex than others," he replied without looking up from his computer. "Best you focus on the straightforward ones for now." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Adira's face haunted me, not just sadness, but fear. I told myself I was being paranoid. Darren was respected in the community. The center had awards lining its walls. The next morning, I arrived early and checked the client database. Adira's file showed only basic intake information. No notes from her meeting with Darren. No follow-up appointment scheduled. No indication of what services had been provided or what had caused her distress. This wasn't standard procedure. Even the briefest client interactions required documentation for grant compliance. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a pattern. Certain clients were always directed to Darren for special handling. Their files remained sparse, and they often left looking worse than when they arrived. I began paying attention to the appointment schedule. Almost every evening, after regular staff departed, Darren would meet with one or two clients. These appointments never appeared in the official calendar. One night, I stayed late, ostensibly to organize the resource library. The center was quiet except for muffled voices from Darren's office. His door was closed, but the old building's ventilation system carried sound in unpredictable ways. 5,000 now, 3,000 when the paperwork clears. Darren's voice came through clearly. But sir, a man responded, his accent thick with fear. This is everything my family has saved for 2 years. The website says your services are free. Free basic services, Darren corrected smoothly. Your situation requires specialized attention. With your asylum status in question and your daughter's medical needs, you can't afford delays. Government processing takes years. I can expedite everything, but that requires leveraging certain relationships. Expensive relationships. My blood ran cold. The center received federal funding specifically to provide free assistance to asylum seekers. If you can't manage it, Darren continued, his voice hardening, I understand. Of course, without proper representation, deportation becomes much more likely, especially with the current administration's policies. The silence that followed felt endless. Then came the sound of counting money. I slipped out before they emerged, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in a place meant to protect vulnerable people. That night, I barely slept, weighing my options. Report Darren to the board? But what if they were complicit? Go to the media? Without evidence, it would be my word against his. Confront him directly? The thought made my stomach clench. The next morning, I watched Darren greet donors at a breakfast fundraiser, charming and passionate about serving our immigrant community with dignity and compassion. The disconnect between his public persona and what I'd overheard made me physically ill. I decided to gather information cautiously. If what I suspected was true, Darren wasn't just bending rules. He was committing federal crimes, exploiting the most vulnerable people in our community, and potentially endangering lives. For the next 2 weeks, I created reasons to stay late, organizing files, preparing for community workshops, decorating for cultural celebrations. Each time, I positioned myself where I could overhear Darren's private meetings. The pattern was consistent. Clients with complicated cases, threats veiled as concerns, and payments that never appeared in official records. I needed help, but I didn't know who to trust. Then I remembered Leela's abrupt departure. Could she have discovered what Darren was doing? I still had her personal email from a staff birthday celebration months ago. My message was casual. Miss seeing you around the office. How's the family emergency going? Coffee sometime? Her response came at 2 a.m. Not safe to discuss. Be careful. Watch your back. Delete this. My hands shook as I stared at her warning. Whatever Leela had discovered had frightened her enough to leave without notice and without explanation to her team. I deleted the email as instructed, but not before taking a screenshot. The next day, Darren called me into his office. Mira, he said, leaning back in his chair. You've been with us, what, almost a year now? 10 months, I corrected. Right. His smile didn't reach his eyes. And you've been quite enthusiastic, staying late, taking on extra projects, asking a lot of questions about client procedures. The air in the room seemed to thin. He knew, somehow, he knew I was investigating him. I'm committed to our mission, I said carefully. Admirable. But I'm concerned you're spreading yourself too thin. He tapped his pen against a stack of papers. I've been reviewing our budget, and unfortunately, we need to make some cuts. Your position will be eliminated at the end of the month. The words hit like a physical blow. My position? But we just received the Rosenthal grant. The center's funding increased by 30%. Something flickered in Darren's eyes, surprised that I knew about the grant, perhaps. Budget allocations are complex. We're restructuring to better serve clients. Translation. I was getting too close to his operation. I understand, I said, hands steady despite my racing heart. When should I finish my cases? You have 4 weeks. I'll need comprehensive notes for whoever takes over. He was already looking back at his computer, dismissing me. 4 weeks. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. That evening, I walked to the small Vietnamese restaurant 6 blocks from the center, far enough that I wouldn't encounter coworkers. I chose a booth in the back and ordered pho, more for the excuse to stay than from hunger. I needed a plan. Confronting Darren directly was dangerous. Going to the board seemed futile. He'd been appointed by them and shared golf memberships with half of them. The local police? Without concrete evidence, they'd likely dismiss my claims as those of a disgruntled employee. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Federal investigation uncovers immigration fraud ring. The article detailed how officials had arrested 3 people who charged immigrants thousands for false promises of expedited processing. Federal investigators. That was my answer. But I needed evidence, solid, undeniable proof that would stand up to scrutiny, and I needed to gather it without Darren realizing what I was doing. The next morning, I arrived early and pulled the center's annual reports for the past 5 years. Official client numbers had steadily increased, while staff had decreased. Government grants had grown, yet program expenses had somehow shrunk. The math didn't add up, but the discrepancies were subtle enough that an auditor might miss them without knowing where to look. I created a separate email account at the public library that evening and sent a message to the FBI's public tip line, explaining my concerns in general terms. Their automated response was discouraging. Thousands of tips received weekly. Many never investigated due to limited resources. I needed something more concrete than financial inconsistencies. I needed witnesses. Over the next week, I began a careful dance. During the day, I was the model employee, efficiently handling cases, training my replacement, a nervous young man named Zeke, who seemed genuinely committed to helping immigrants, and never staying late. But during lunch breaks and after hours, I became a detective. I started frequenting a coffee shop near the bus stop where many of our clients waited for transportation. Pretending to read or work on my laptop, I would make small talk, building relationships. When clients recognized me from the center, I'd mention that I was leaving soon and ask about their experiences. Most gave vague, positive responses, but occasionally I'd see a flicker of something else: hesitation, fear, or anger quickly masked. Those were the ones I focused on. Tarek, a Syrian refugee who'd come through the center 6 months earlier, eventually opened up after our 3rd coincidental meeting. He said my family's case was complicated, Tarek whispered, looking around nervously. That for $3,000, he could guarantee our asylum approval. We sold everything to pay him. 3 months later, we received notice of a hearing. When I asked him why it wasn't approved as promised, he said there were unexpected complications and needed another $2,000. Did you pay? I asked gently. Tarek stared into his coffee. My daughter has diabetes. We can't risk being sent back. There's no insulin in our hometown now. By the end of my 2nd week of investigation, I had conversations with 7 clients who'd paid Darren for services that should have been free. But conversations weren't enough. I needed documentation. I couldn't risk copying anything from the center's systems. Darren was tech-savvy enough to track digital footprints. Instead, I memorized details: names, dates, amounts, file numbers, and recorded them in an encrypted app on my personal phone each night. As my termination date approached, I grew increasingly anxious. My evidence was still circumstantial at best. Then, unexpectedly, Zeke provided an opportunity. I found something weird, he said quietly as we ate lunch in the park across from the center. I was entering client notes, and there are these gaps in the records, like client meetings with no documentation of what happened. I kept my expression neutral. The system can be glitchy. Sometimes notes don't save properly. That's what I thought at first. but it's only certain appointments, ones with Darren, and only with clients from countries on the restricted immigration list. Zeke was sharper than I'd given him credit for. Be careful mentioning that, I warned. Administrative oversights are taken very seriously. His eyes widened slightly at my tone. You know something. I hesitated, then made a calculated risk. What would you do if you suspected something unethical was happening at the center? Report it, obviously, he said without hesitation. To whom? That gave him pause. I'm not sure. Darren's the director. Exactly. And the board trusts him implicitly. Understanding dawned on his face. Is that why you're leaving? You found something? I neither confirmed nor denied. But my silence was answer enough. I want to help, he said quietly. It could be dangerous, I warned. My parents came here as refugees. This center is supposed to help people like them, not exploit them. Zeke became my inside man. While I continued gathering testimonials from former clients, he carefully documented irregularities without raising suspicion. 2 days before my last day, he texted me. Dee has 3 special appointments tomorrow afternoon, all recent asylum applicants from Venezuela. This was my chance. I contacted 3 clients I'd built relationships with, Tarek, Imani, and Luis. Smeeded paid Darren's special fees. Each had been afraid to come forward alone, but together, they found courage. They agreed to meet with a federal agent I'd finally connected with through persistent follow-ups to my initial tip. Agent Kishi was skeptical at first, but the consistent pattern in my evidence convinced her to investigate. We need more than testimonials, she explained. We need to catch him in the act. The plan was simple but risky. The 3 clients would wear wires and meet with Darren during my final day, expressing concerns about their cases and recording any improper demands for payment. Agent Kishi would monitor from a van parked nearby. The morning of my last day arrived with a thunderstorm that matched my churning emotions. What if something went wrong? What if Darren suspected a trap? What if the clients backed out? I arrived early, soaked from the rain despite my umbrella. The center was quiet, most staff delayed by the storm. I used the time to send one final encrypted message to Agent Kishi confirming the plan, then deleted the app from my phone. When Darren arrived, he barely acknowledged me. Throughout the morning, I processed paperwork mechanically, saying goodbye to colleagues who expressed generic regret at my departure. By lunchtime, my nerves were frayed. Tarek arrived at 1 p.m., looking terrified but determined. I pretended not to notice him as Darren escorted him to the private meeting room rather than his office, a deviation from routine that made my stomach clench. Had he suspected something? At 1:45, Imani arrived with her young daughter. Again, Darren intercepted them before they reached the reception desk. I watched from my peripheral vision as he guided them not to the meeting room, but toward the building's rear exit. Something was wrong. This wasn't the plan. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Abort. He's moving meetings off-site. K. My heart sank. Months of work. Ruined. Without recordings of Darren explicitly demanding money, we had nothing concrete enough for charges. At 2:30, Darren returned alone, looking satisfied. When he spotted me watching, his expression hardened. That's when he called the impromptu farewell gathering in the break room, culminating in his public suggestion that I never show my face again. As I sat on that park bench watching the center, defeat threatened to overwhelm me. Agent Kishi approached, sitting beside me without acknowledging my presence. It's over, I whispered. He changed the routine. He must have suspected something. Actually, she replied quietly, this might work in our favor. He took them to the coffee shop next door, which happens to be within our surveillance perimeter. And that public humiliation you just experienced? Excellent motive for a disgruntled employee story. I didn't understand until she explained further. The investigation hadn't begun with my tip at all. The FBI had been watching Darren for months as part of a larger investigation into immigration fraud. My evidence had simply accelerated their timeline and provided insider confirmation. We have enough for a warrant now, she said, standing. Your clients are safe. We'll move within the hour. What about me? I asked. Go home. You've done your part. We'll contact you if we need testimony. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I needed to see it through. So I waited, pretending to browse job listings on my phone while my future hung in the balance. 1 hour passed. Then, 90 minutes. I watched Tarek exit the center quickly, head down, walking briskly away. Had the operation failed? Just as I was about to give up, 3 unmarked vehicles pulled up to the center. Agents emerged, moving with purposeful efficiency toward the entrance. My heart hammered as they disappeared inside. The next 30 minutes stretched endlessly. Staff began exiting the building, looking confused. Clients were escorted out separately, some being interviewed by agents on the sidewalk. Then, the front doors opened again. 2 agents emerged with Darren between them, hands cuffed behind his back. His expression of shocked outrage was visible even from across the street. As they guided him toward a waiting vehicle, his gaze swept the area and locked onto me. I didn't hide. I didn't look away. I simply raised my coffee cup in a small toast, his face contorted with rage as the realization hit him. I wasn't just a nosy employee. I was the reason his empire was crumbling. As they placed him in the vehicle, a weight lifted from my shoulders. But this wasn't just about my vindication. It was about Tarek's daughter getting insulin without her family going bankrupt. It was about Imani's asylum case being fairly reviewed. It was about restoring the center to its original mission. Agent Kishi approached me again as the vehicles pulled away. Nice work, Ms. Acharya. We found enough evidence in his office to put him away for a long time. Multiple counts of fraud, extortion, even evidence of bribery of immigration officials. What happens to the center now? I asked, my main concern being the vulnerable clients who depended on its services. That's not up to us. But given the circumstances, I imagine there will be quite a reorganization. She was right. 2 weeks later, I received a call from the center's board chair, Vivienne. We had no idea, she said, her voice tight with what sounded like genuine distress. Darren presented perfect reports. Our audits showed nothing unusual. He was careful, I acknowledged. We'd like you to come back, Mira, with a promotion. We need someone with your integrity to help rebuild trust. The offer was tempting. For a moment, I imagined returning triumphant, implementing changes, reshaping the center into what it was meant to be. But then I pictured walking through those same doors every morning, sitting at the same desk where I'd plotted against Darren, using the same systems he'd corrupted. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I think the center needs a completely fresh start. Vivienne sounded disappointed but understanding. The door remains open if you change your mind. Instead, I volunteered to help with the transition, training new staff and rebuilding client trust without officially rejoining. In the evenings, I started teaching citizenship preparation classes at the community college, finding satisfaction in directly helping immigrants navigate their path to becoming Americans. 3 months after Darren's arrest, federal prosecutors contacted me. They needed my testimony for his trial. He's claiming ignorance. The assistant prosecutor, Ren, explained during our preparation meeting, says he had no knowledge of the payments, that someone else must have been collecting money from clients. That's absurd, I replied. I heard him directly solicit payments. Your testimony will be crucial, Ren said, but be prepared. His defense will try to paint you as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. The irony wasn't lost on me. Isn't that exactly what I am? Ren smiled thinly. The difference is, you're telling the truth. The trial was scheduled for spring, 6 months away. In the meantime, life developed a new rhythm. My citizenship classes grew popular, with many students bringing friends and family members. I consulted for several immigrant advocacy organizations, helping them strengthen their ethical oversight practices. Occasionally, I'd run into former clients from the center who would update me on their cases, most progressing more smoothly now that corrupt barriers had been removed. One evening after class, I found Tarek waiting outside my classroom. Miss Mira, he said, extending a small gift bag. My daughter and I wanted to thank you. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf and a crayon drawing of what appeared to be me standing beside a little girl. Hero was written across the top in a child's uneven lettering. I began. You are to us, he interrupted firmly. The new people at the center reviewed our case. We received asylum approval last week. No extra payments, no threats. Moments like these made the hardships worthwhile. But as Darren's trial approached, my anxiety grew. My testimony would be public. His wealthy friends would hear every detail. I'd made powerful enemies by exposing his scheme. Agent Kishi called a week before the trial. "We need to talk," she said, her voice unusually tight. "Not over the phone." We met at a diner halfway between my apartment and the federal building. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. "The case is more complicated than we initially thought," she said after ordering coffee. Darren wasn't acting alone. My stomach dropped. The board members? Some of them, yes, but also officials within the immigration system. We've uncovered a network that extends into multiple agencies. What does that mean for the trial? Kishi stirred her coffee slowly. Darren's attorneys have approached us about a deal. A deal? The word tasted bitter. After everything he did to those families? He's offering names, dates, bank accounts, evidence against 12 other conspirators, including 2 immigration judges and a senior official at Homeland Security. I understood the implications immediately. In exchange for leniency, she nodded grimly. "The prosecutor wanted you to know before you read it in the papers. Your testimony may not be needed if he pleads to reduce charges." The justice I'd imagined, Darren behind bars for decades, his victims vindicated in open court, evaporated. So he gets a slap on the wrist while those families are still dealing with the consequences of his actions. "He'll serve time," Kishi assured me. "Just not as much as we'd hoped, and he'll forfeit all assets gained through the scheme. That money will go toward a restitution fund for victims." I left our meeting feeling hollow. The system I'd trusted to deliver justice was making compromises I couldn't stomach. That night, I barely slept, turning over alternatives in my mind. By morning, I'd made a decision. I called Zeke, who had remained at the center through the transition and become a trusted ally. "I need access to the client database, just for a few hours." There was a pause. "That's not exactly by the book, Mira. Neither was what happened to those families." Another pause. "Saturday morning. The interim director will be at a conference. I'll be handling the weekend shift alone." On Saturday, I arrived early. Zeke let me in through the side entrance and set me up at a workstation in the resource library. 2 hours, he said nervously. "That's all I can give you before the volunteers arrive." It was enough. I wasn't copying files or stealing information. I was creating a map, contact information, case statuses, all clients who had interactions with Darren during his special appointments. Over the next 3 weeks, I contacted every person on my list. Many were reluctant to speak at first, fear of immigration consequences overriding their sense of injustice. But as news of Darren's plea deal spread, anger began to replace fear. "He pays a fine and spends 2 years in minimum security," Luis said during our meeting at a community garden where he volunteered. "While my brother remains in detention because of false information Darren provided to authorities." Similar stories emerged across my interviews. It wasn't just the money Darren had extorted. He had deliberately complicated cases when clients couldn't pay, falsified information, and in some instances, created problems that hadn't existed before. With permission from 43 former clients, I compiled their stories into a comprehensive document, not just accounts of financial exploitation, but the human cost of Darren's actions. Children separated from parents, medical treatments delayed, educations interrupted, lives derailed. I took this document to 3 places: the Federal Prosecutor's Office, the State Bar Association's Ethics Committee, and a journalist named Prisha who specialized in immigration issues. "This won't change his plea deal," Ren warned when I handed over the file. "That's already been approved by the judge." "I understand," I replied, "but it should be part of the official record." The Bar Association was more receptive. Darren had been an attorney before becoming the center's director, and ethical violations could result in disbarment, a punishment that would follow him long after his prison term ended. Prisha, the journalist, reviewed the document for 5 days before contacting me. "This is extensive," she said when we met at her office. "But publishing means these people would have to go on record. Are they prepared for that level of exposure?" "They've each signed consent forms," I explained. They understand the risks. They're tired of hiding. The story broke 2 days before Darren's sentencing hearing. Betrayal of trust. Immigrant advocate exploited vulnerable clients, ran across the front page of the city's largest newspaper. Prisha had done a masterful job, weaving individual stories into a damning narrative of systematic exploitation. Television news picked it up immediately. By evening, national outlets were running segments featuring interviews with victims brave enough to speak on camera. Public outrage was swift and overwhelming. Protesters gathered outside the federal courthouse. Immigration advocacy groups released statements condemning the lenient plea deal. The governor called for a state-level investigation into similar programs. The morning of the sentencing, I arrived at the courthouse to find it surrounded by media vans and demonstrators carrying signs with phrases like "Justice for immigrants" and "No deals for predators." Inside, the courtroom was packed. I sat in the back, anonymous among the crowd. Darren entered wearing an expensive suit, flanked by attorneys. He looked confident until he turned and saw the gallery filled with his former clients. His step faltered momentarily. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Judge Amara Okafor was known for her no-nonsense approach and meticulous attention to detail. She reviewed the plea agreement with an impassive expression, occasionally making notes. "Before I accept this agreement," she said finally, "I want to address some new information that has come to my attention." She held up a copy of Prisha's article. 43 victims have come forward with detailed accounts that go far beyond the charges in this plea. While I understand the value of Mr. Blackwood's cooperation against co-conspirators, I cannot ignore the extent of harm documented here. Darren's attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor, those allegations haven't been verified or tested in court. The agreement was made in good faith." "The agreement," Judge Okafor interrupted, "is a recommendation to the court, not a binding contract. And in light of these testimonials, I find it insufficient." She turned her gaze directly to Darren. "Mr. Blackwood, you used your position of trust to exploit vulnerable individuals seeking help. You didn't simply take their money. You actively damaged their immigration cases when they couldn't pay, placing families at risk of separation and deportation." While the judge closed the file, "I am rejecting this plea agreement as not in the interest of justice. The defendant may either withdraw his guilty plea and proceed to trial on all original charges, or accept sentencing at the court's discretion without the benefit of the government's recommendation." Darren's face drained of color. His attorney requested a recess to confer. When court reconvened an hour later, Darren looked defeated. His attorney announced that he would maintain his guilty plea, but without the agreement's sentencing provisions. Judge Okafor nodded. "Very well. I hereby sentence the defendant to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Additionally, the court orders full restitution to all identified victims, and I am recommending to the Bar Association that disbarment proceedings be initiated immediately." The gallery remained silent as Darren was led away. Outside, reporters swarmed around victims willing to speak, capturing their reactions to the unexpected outcome. I slipped away unnoticed, walking the 6 blocks to the community college, where my citizenship class would begin in an hour. My phone buzzed with messages. Zeke, Agent Kishi, Prisha, all wanting to discuss the sentencing. I'd respond later. For now, I needed to process what had happened. The revenge I'd initially sought, watching Darren led away in handcuffs, had been just the beginning. The true victory was in reclaiming the narrative, in giving voice to those who had been silenced, in ensuring that the full scope of his crimes couldn't be buried in a convenient plea deal. As I prepared my classroom for the evening's lesson on civic responsibilities, Tarek arrived early with his daughter. "We saw the news," he said simply. "You did this." I shook my head. "You all did this, by being brave enough to tell your stories. But you gave us the platform," he insisted. "You could have walked away after he was arrested." His daughter tugged at his hand. "Papa, show her." Tarek smiled and removed an envelope from his pocket. "My daughter received this yesterday." Inside was a citizenship appointment notice. After years in limbo, their case was moving forward. As more students arrived, many mentioned the sentencing or showed me similar notices of progress in their cases. The system, flawed as it was correcting itself. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. That evening, as I taught about the rights and responsibilities of American citizenship, I felt a sense of closure. Darren had wanted me to disappear, to slink away in shame. Instead, I had become more visible than ever, advocating for the very people he had tried to exploit. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't what you do to your enemy, but what you build from the ashes they leave behind. In my case, it was a community of empowered immigrants who would never again be silenced by fear. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience. Have you ever stood up against corruption or helped someone find their voice? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that crucial first step toward justice. Remember, change often begins with one person brave enough to speak truth to power.